everybody. My name is Dr. Yusuf Çelik and I'm a part-time lecturer and researcher at the University of Utrecht. Currently, I'm collaborating with Professor Dr. Christian Lange, who holds the Chair of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Utrecht, on a Digital Humanities project in which we try to compute and map out the footprint of the Qur'an in various legal works. The works in question have been hand-selected by Professor Lange, and they comprise 55 works belonging to the 5 major legal schools in the Islamic tradition. In the coming minutes, I would like to present the fruits of our labor together, which is the Footprinter platform, a platform in which the Quran footprint in various legal works can be tracked and further analyzed. The Footprinter platform has a variety of options that you could explore. The first is the network analysis, which is basically to visualize all of the verses in relation to the various schools. And there is the historicity table. This allows you to see at what point certain verses were first cited, for example, by Ash-Shafi'i, and then subsequently by other authors or not, which in this case is very interesting because Ash-Shafi'i is citing 1-4 for a certain legal argument, and in the late post-classical period, Al-Dimyati and Al-Jamal are citing it, but none of the other authors are citing it in between. But there are other verses, very popular verses, that are obviously cited by a chain of authors, and it's possible then to analyze the who is citing it for which legal argument, but I'll come back to that later. Then there is the possibility to do a search based on a verse. So it's possible to say I want to search based on verse 112.1 and see what kind of legal arguments it served and which authors were the ones citing it, which schools, how many times it is present in a corpus, and that's about it for the last part, which is the statistics. And the statistics allows you to gain some insight into the more statistical aspects of our computation. So which 50 most cited verses are there, and which school is citing what, how many times can be seen easily. But there is also the top 10 tables that allows us to see, for example, that the Shafi'i school cites 282, 199 times in 10 works of the 11 works that we have been analyzing. So these are the verses that have been shared by all schools, with certain verses that are exclusively Shia. For example, 460 seems to be cited by only Shia authors for certain legal arguments. And this can of course then be clicked on, and you can then read how the Shia authors are using it for which arguments. But again, I'll explore that better in a moment. So let's go back then to the network. The network page has a variety of options. So the network itself is obviously what we see here. So all the golden dots are basically the highlighted verses, and the bigger dots are the works. This, of course, being 2,954 verses, is a lot of information, and there is you need to know some things in order to interpret this properly. But it's also possible to narrow down, hone in, and read other things from this network, this visualization that you're seeing in front of you. which I'll go into detail in a second. So this can be done, this kind of filtering, honing in, by going through the various visualization settings. So for example, if you want to see who is contributing to what extent to this network, you could, for example, go through the periods. These are just heuristic segments that we have applied. They are obviously not something that is set in stone in a sense, but what is very nice to see is, for example, we can just click away these sections and just go back to the formative period, and then we can see which authors then we consider from that period. But as you can see, there are only 808 verses in the formative period, and a lot of the rest of the network falls to the wayside, kind of gets unselected, hence not being gold. Yeah, so what we see here is the traditional core, which is more in the center, is obviously created in the formative area. And then it is possible to continue onwards and test various hypotheses and read out, for example, is it really so that in the post-classical area a lot of the Qur'an is being cited. And if we go and click there, we see just based on these post-classical authors, we can basically see that a lot of the network is being filled in by their citations, especially those that are uniquely cited or only cited a few times, that don't belong to the traditional core. But there are a lot of other options that one can explore on this webpage. So we could, for example, compare the earliest authors, like let's just go to Al-Shaybani, Al-Shafi, and Al-Maliki, Malik, and then we can just see that they total, as a total, they just cite 600 verses. And if we simplify to this selection, we can actually see who is citing the majority of the verses, and in this case it is Shafi'i, who cites in a lot of verses, and both Al-Asl and Al-Muwatta contain relatively little verses, and some of these verses overlap, so there is some verses that are being shared, but the majority, the grunt of the citations is made up by a Shafi'i. And it is also possible to see, for example, verses that have been cited by each school, and this is the center, so the traditional core seems to be these verses that have been cited by the 5 schools, so including the Jafari school, and this seems to really coincide with the traditional tallies concerning the Ahkam ayat. And it is also possible to go and see the more exclusive kind of citations. So for example, if I want to see what is exclusively contributed by the Shafi'i scholars, then we see these islands that are being that are colored yellow, so that we have a tight visual grasp of these additions made by the Shafi'i scholars. And now I'll get to the last point, which is to say that if you want to explore further, you could obviously do things like zoom in, but sometimes that's not that helpful. And you could, of course, and that's where the power from Footprinter comes, click on a certain verse, and we see here the verse 75:22, and immediately you will be confronted with the citation of the verse, the translation in English, how many authors are citing it, and to which schools they belong, so the general statistics. But then you can see it being highlighted in the work itself. In this case, in Dimyati's work, we see it, and we can then read to in what kind of way, to what end it is being used by al-Dimyati, and you can then also like go through the work itself, paginate through it, and see and read. It is also possible, excuse me, to read, to go to like the more heavily cited verses in the center, and then to actually see that it's being cited around 300 times by 5 different schools, by 37 different authors, and it's about 10 pages of results. So Al-Muzani is citing it, and then if we scroll onwards, we'll see that Al-Hisni is citing it, and it could be potentially that each author is citing a different portion of the verse, and that can be seen and read here, which says, on which grounds do we associate, do we count this as a reference of 237, and in this case it is the part that is the فَنِصْفُ مَا فَرَضْتُمْ, and you can obviously read it back in the ayah itself, so فَنِصْفُ مَا فَرَضْتُمْ. But the وَإِن طَلَقْتُمْ مُوهُنَّ is not the part that is being cited here, whilst at another section Muzani is referring to that part, and some other author, in this case again Muzani, but Al-Hisni is really focusing on the نِصْفُ مَا فَرَضْتُمْ, and it is possible to paginate through these results and have them loaded in, and then just go about and read and understand what parts of verses were used for legal arguments, to what ends, and it gives us a better insight into those kind of citations. And especially when the exclusivity scan is being done, you can really go in and see some of the more creative ways of incorporating the Quran into legal arguments. The core, which has verses on fasting and verses on prayer, is more obviously used for legal arguments, but then those who are the verses on the periphery are more interesting in that sense to see, as we saw a moment ago, incidentally, about faces being bright on I think in the hereafter. So that is usually a theological verse, and not so much a legal verse. And so continuing onwards, there's a lot of different configurations to go about, and it is a heuristic tool to open up new research possibilities and questions and insights in a very handy way, instead of going about having all these books and scanning them word-based, because that is the next thing that I want to show, which is the reverse index. Instead of having to do these kind of exact searches or these fuzzy searches with a lot of false positives, you could just type in a certain verse. In this case, let's go for the lakum dinukum waliyadin, and then actually read which authors cited. And it's a verse that is not being cited that much, which is very interesting when we contrast it to our present day, wherein the verse really gets to be cited a lot, especially in the context of interreligious dialogue and religious pluralism. So in this case, we see that only 6 authors are citing it, and then incidentally and maybe ironically even, they're citing it to make the point that it is actually the Muslims that are considered one deen, and all the other religions are considered also as one deen. So in essence, there's only two religions, the religion of truth and the religion of falsehood. In this sense, we see that also here with Al-Ghazali arguing لأن جميع الملة في البطلان كالملة الواحدة, and that allows them to make arguments about Muslims not being able to inherit Jews and Christians, but a Jew is able to inherit a Christian because they're essentially the same religion. But so this is also very indicative of the little interest shown, because there are only like 7 citations, but excuse me, other verses that are about suckling, or the verse on Hajj, for example, is being cited so many times that we can see that with this reverse search you can also find out about not only what scholars thought, but how much of a presence a certain verse had in legal works. Then there is, of course, the historicity, and the historicity allows us to just open up possibilities of seeing how maybe a verse is used for a certain legal argument in the early periods and then evolving into another kind of argument, or used for different purposes. And this is just a handy way to gain more insight on that aspect. And the only rule that I've stipulated here is that in the case of the Shafi'i school, it has to start with being cited by Shafi, and then it is then traced a verse onwards and localized in other works. So in this case, for example, 282 is only being cited by Shafi in formative period, but then later on by Al-Jamal, and no one in between cites this. And funnily enough, we see this also with 508. It is being cited by Shafi and then consequently by Al-Mawardi, but the later Shafi authors do not use it for any kind of legal argument anymore. And if we click on it, we can see how that kind of works out, and read more upon how it was used and to what extent it was used. And if we continue onwards, we can see the same kind of thing. But also very interesting is 480, for example, which is only to be found in Al-Umm, but then later Shafi authors, none of them use it for any kind of legal argument, and kind of shows that, and the later works are quite sizable. Al-Mawardi's Al-Hawi Al-Kabir is, for example, a very big work, and yet it does not contain this verse for a legal argument that or some other argument that Shafi is making. And it is almost as if Shafi is doing laying all this creative groundwork, I believe, that is not then followed up in all of its aspects. Some might take certain verses and some insights from Shafi, but not all of them in a later tradition. So this is not to say that to say things like, okay, this verse had no significance for Shafi authors or whatever. The data that we have is not that extensive to make those kind of claims, but at the very least it could inspire further research into the matter. And the same goes also for Malik, where one could see whether, to what extent Malik is still dominating certain ways in which a legal matter is handled by arguing from the Qur'an, and then subsequent authors are just taking it, over and are repeating what Malik is being saying or modifying it even. And this allows us to kind of have a helpful way into looking into that and read and see more and take notes of that and hopefully be able to guide certain research questions. And then there is the statistics, and statistics is the final aspect that I wish to demonstrate. And statistics allows us, for example, to see which verses were like exclusively used by Shia, and 460 is incidentally one of those verses, and it is being used by a variety of Ja'fari authors, and we see in some cases that at some pages that some authors introducing it, later authors are taking over the argument verbatim, but it's not something that is being used by other scholars in the 55 works that we have scanned. And that's kind of interesting to then ask the following question: why is it that the Ja'faris are only using this verse, and what is it in their particular legal tradition that makes it so inherently interesting for them to use? So let me just then conclude with saying the following. This is still in the beta phase. We're still working out certain kinks, but ultimately the idea is to release it soon enough and then to get feedback and then to further improve upon it. And any kind of feedback, any kind of feature requests are very much appreciated.